Once your studio has its fair share of boutique, analog and modular synths that you love to tinker with, and your virtual instrument collection is brimming, you may find yourself considering a multi-timbral hardware synth that can provide your bread and butter sounds, but also be a great instrument in its own right. You've narrowed your selection to Roland FANTOM and Yamaha MONTAGE because you've heard that both can be a great centerpiece to a studio or a live rig. So which is better? I've owned both of these synthesizers for several years, and I think that there are some important differences between them that tend not to get discussed in enough detail, so that's what I want to do here. This is definitely not an all playing no talking video. There are a number of videos online on this subject, but they tend to focus on a fairly shallow review of which sounds better, rather than what these instruments are actually like to work with. I'm comparing the original 2017 Montage with the 2019 Fantom because the things I want to discuss are primarily platform and architecture level differences, which affect both these original models and their recent incarnations. This video will focus on differences that make a difference to me, so there will be features I don't cover in any depth, such as the sequences of each machine or the Fantom sampler, as I tend to use a computer for those functions and I don't have enough experience using the onboard features to offer an opinion I'd consider to be valuable. The fundamental principle of both Montage and Fantom is to present an interface with 16 slots into which you can load up to 16 separate sounds to be played all together, in groups or separately. Montage calls this arrangement a performance, and each of the 16 slots are called parts. Fantom calls the 16-part arrangement a scene, and the slots are called zones into which you can load tones. Montage has different meanings for scene and zone, so bear in mind that while I'm talking about the Fantom, the word scene is roughly equivalent to a Montage performance, and a Fantom zone correlates to a Montage part. On Montage, the first 8 parts are directly playable with the keyboard at all times. The remaining 8 parts are only playable either by directly selecting one of them or by incoming MIDI messages from an external source, although you can easily work around this if you're working with a DAW. On Fantom, all 16 zones are directly playable, although as we'll see later in the video, this is not always practical due to polyphony limits. Another difference in the 16 available parts is that Montage allows you to load any sound into any part. It doesn't care what synthesis engine is being used to create each sound, so you don't need to keep in mind that specific sounds can only inhabit specific parts. Fantom is far more strict. For example, sounds using the V-piano engine can only live in Zone 1, as can sounds using ACB model expansions from Fantom EX, and sounds using the tone wheel organ engine can only live in Zone 2. When you attempt to load any of these types into other zones, they simply don't appear as options at all, which can be a little confusing at first and slightly irritating later when you want to bring in those instruments and found that you've already used those zones with other sounds while building your scene. I'm just going to pause the comparison for a moment here to ask you to hit the subscribe button, as doing so really helps this channel and makes my work in producing these videos all the more worthwhile. Thank you. For me, the most important difference between Montage and Fantom is the distinction between Montage performances and Fantom scenes. At the lowest level of the Montage's AWM2 engine and Fantom's zen-core system are waveforms, which are multi-samples that live either in preset or user memory. In Fantom, the manner in which these waveforms are played is controlled by tones, and tones can be loaded into any of the 16 zones that make up a scene. But fundamentally, tones and scenes are entirely different data structures. Tones and scenes save their own settings and configuration and do not overlap in their functions. Conversely, Montage just has a single data structure, performances, which controls both the arrangement of sounds into one of the 16 parts, but also the structure of the sounds themselves, which Fantom controls with tones. In the case of FMX sounds on Montage, where there are no waveforms involved, the entirety of the sound data exists within the performance. So whereas Fantom has you load a tone into a zone in a scene, Montage loads parts of other performances into your current performance, along with all settings that were made in the incoming performance. That might not seem like a massive difference until you consider this scenario. Let's bring in the simple saw brass sound into this performance. We'll just select a part, open the category browser and bring in the sound. Now let's make some edits to that sound. I'm going to drop the cutoff for all the elements, and then on the filter envelope I'm going to increase the attack time and amount for each envelope so we get a sound that takes a little longer to develop. I'll come back to the performance mode, Hit Store to save the performance, and that's it, all done. My performance now contains the sounds I want with the edits I want. Importantly, if I go back to the category browser and listen to Simple Sawbrass, it's still in its original state without the edits I made. But if I load my demo performance again, there is Simple Sawbrass with my edits. Now let's do the same on Fantom. We'll take an existing scene and make some edits to the sound in one of the zones to suit our current scene. Then we'll save the scene and the edits to my sound are lost. What you've just seen is the Fantom saving the scene and reloading it, which wiped out the edits to the sound, because with Fantom those edits to the sound are not saved with the scene, but with the tone. So what I actually need to do is go and save the edited tone, giving it a new name to distinguish it from the original version. Now I can save the scene again, and it will reference the newly saved tone instead of the original. Now, not only is that inconvenient when you're making edits to the sound that only make sense in the context of this current scene, but each time we save a copy of the same tone, we have to come up with a meaningful name, or else our tone system gets more and more congested with sometimes dozens of copies of the same sound with minor edits. So you might be thinking that's not such a bad thing, because you might want that edited version of the sound in another scene in the future. But Montage has you covered there too, because as I said, you can bring in parts from any performance to any other performance. So if you want to use that edited version of the sound in another performance, just select it and off you go. Another consequence of the separately referenced tone system is that, let's say you've made a Fantom scene with a custom version of one of your sounds, and the scene is perfect, and you never want to touch it again apart from to play it. Then you go and create a new scene and you bring in your custom tone. You make some edits to that tone to suit the new scene, and save it. That's fine for that scene, but when you go back to your old scene that you never wanted to touch again, the edits that you made to the tone in the new scene are also reflected in the old scene, which could potentially completely mess it up. Fantom scenes are much more simple data structures than Montage performances. They store little more than which tone is loaded into which zone, how it should respond to the keyboard, and what effects should be added, along with any patterns or songs that have been created with the sequencer. In some cases, you can get away with not saving an edited copy of a tone because scenes can store offsets for a small selection of tone parameters. These are limited to cutoff and resonance and VCA attack, decay and release, and they have to be dialed into the scene manually rather than picking up any edits you've made to the tones that use those parameters. All the remaining configuration for the sounds themselves is stored separately as tones rather than being saved with the scene. The one use case in which the Montage approach is not ideal is if you're the kind of person who has signature sounds you're constantly tweaking, which are used with multiple songs. In this instance, every time you make edits to that sound, you'd need to manually update all your saved Montage performances to bring in those edits. So if this is you, then the Fantom approach of tones being separate from scenes might suit you better. In my opinion, the unified performances approach from Montage is dramatically superior to Fantom's disconnected scenes and tones and makes for a much better workflow. This difference between how Fantom scenes and Montage performances work leads to another big contrast in the way that you search for and find sounds on each system. At the top level, Montage offers the live set system, where you can define a live set containing up to 16 performances for playing live or just generally organising things the way you want. Any performance can be added to any live set, so if you want the JP Strings performance to appear multiple times or even in all your live sets, that's fine. The live set system exists in addition to the category search system, which is your primary method to find performances. Using category search, you can set and retrieve favourite performances, search by bank, attribute, and also by text. There's a well-defined category and subcategory system, which you can browse either using the touchscreen or using the button grid on the right of the keyboard. The first 8 performances on screen can also be selected using the button grid, and buttons are provided to allow you to scroll the list up and down. When searching for a performance, there's a helpful audition facility which will play back a short piece of music programmed by the sound designer, demonstrating how they intended to use each performance. Each performance that matches your search parameters is listed together with a helpful set of icons that tell you what kind of sound engines are used by the performance, whether it uses motion control, and whether or not it supports seamless sound switching. Once you have a performance loaded, the process to load a sound into a part is exactly the same, with the same category browser used to locate additional performances you want to load into subsequent parts of your current performance. On Fantom, you have the Scene browser, which shows scenes on multiple pages organised by bank and number. This differs from the Montage Live Set system in that the Scene browser pages represent the actual stored locations of the scenes, rather than just being pointers to scenes that are located in a different system. As a result, if you want to create a live set arrangement like Montage, you'll need to actually create duplicates of your scenes into distinct pages to have them appear together on the same page. On the plus side, the Scene browser does have a simple text search facility to find your scenes by name, and the ability to set a star rating for scenes so that you can quickly find your favourites. Scenes also have the ability to store a snippet of text to give hints as to their intended use, and this is shown on the Scene browser once you click on a scene. Once you've loaded a scene and you want to load tones into zones, things become quite different. Because remember, tones are not the same as scenes. Unlike the Montage, everything is a performance approach. To load a tone, you select a zone and then click one of the category selection buttons to open the tone browser, which is completely different from the Scene browser. In most cases, there's the ability to specify a subcategory, although the selection of subcategories tends to be less granular than those offered by Montage. You can use the various controls around the screen to filter down the list of tones, including a star rating favourite system and text search. But remember, if you aren't looking at Zone 1, then you can't load a V-piano, and if you're in anything other than Zone 2, you can't load an organ using the virtual tone wheel engine. It just won't appear as an option at all. It has to be said that the sound searching facilities of both Montage and Fantom are largely put to shame by a number of software-based systems, including complete control by native instruments, which allows sounds to be tagged rather than categorized, which means that a sound that includes brass and strings can be tagged as such, having both brass and strings tags. The same sound on Montage and Fantom would have to be categorized as either brass or strings, making it more difficult to find. Before we get started talking about sound engines, I want to clear something up. Both Montage and Fantom make extensive use of PCM samples for many of the sounds they produce, and as a result they're often referred to rather disparagingly as romplers, suggesting that all they do is play back pre-recorded samples. But in fact, both of the sample-based synthesis engines in these instruments are powerful subtractive synthesizers, which only differ from virtual analog systems in that they use samples as oscillators rather than simple sine, square and sawtooth waveforms. Montage has two sound engines, the sample-based AWM2 engine as seen in the Motif series, and the FMX engine, which takes the 6-operator FM engine from the DX7 and builds on it with 2 additional operators and the full array of Montage effects. Yamaha's AWM2 technology was first introduced with the SY77 synthesizer in 1989. The system has been refined and expanded over time, and it's now found in just about every digital keyboard instrument they produce, including the YC, CP and CK stage keyboards, the Genos and PSR arrangers, the Clavinova and other digital pianos, and many more. Yamaha's FM engine was made famous by the DX7, and the sounds it produced can rightly be considered to be the sound of the early 1980s. The FMX engine in Montage is backward compatible with the DX7, so it's possible to load any of the thousands of DX7 patches available online, including the original factory ROM, into the Montage and have them play exactly as they did on the original hardware. While the DX7 had 16-note polyphony and 6 operators, the FMX engine in Montage significantly builds on these capabilities with 128-note polyphony and 8 operators, allowing for a huge variety of algorithm shapes and far more complex sound design. Additionally, the DX7 had no onboard effects, but the FMX engine in Montage benefits from the full range of effects that are available in Montage, including reverb, delay, chorus distortion, and many more. You can load an FMX sound into any of the 16 parts of a Montage performance, allowing you to layer and split the sounds across the keyboard, so the end result is that Montage effectively allows you to play 16 DX7s at the same time. The original Montage has 128 stereo voice polyphony for AWM2 sounds and a further independent 128 voices for FMX sounds. The Montage M adds a third engine called ANX, which is a virtual analog engine inspired by the classic Yamaha AN1X synthesizer. Montage M adds another 128 stereo voices specifically for user-imported AWM2 waveforms and 16 voice polyphony for ANX. Fantom has several sound engines in order to cover both acoustic and synth-based sounds. Most of the preset sounds in Fantom are built on zen-core, which is a highly capable hybrid, multi-sample and virtual analog synthesis engine designed to be able to produce almost any sound from Roland's synthesizer back catalogue. The zen-core engine is the basis of almost all Roland's current synthesizer products, including the Zenology software synthesizer available from Roland Cloud. Theoretically, a zen-core tone created on any zen-core capable system should be portable to any other zen-core synthesizer. So for example, you could create tones using the software interface of Zenology and bring them across to Fantom on a USB drive. While zen-core is very good at producing synth sounds, the architecture is less capable when it comes to reproducing acoustic instruments, and Fantom includes a handful of specialized engines to make up for these shortcomings. The first of these is vPiano, which is a modeling engine, meaning that the sound of a piano is generated with a physical model rather than by playing samples. This model is sufficiently detailed to allow you to set the lid position and various resonance levels, including sympathetic string resonance. Fantom has a modelled virtual tone wheel organ with a Leslie speaker that can be controlled by the pitch wiggler thingy, which also makes a cool animation on the synth control LEDs to show the speed at which the speaker is spinning. Next on the list are Roland's supernatural instrument sounds, which are sample-based but enhanced with instrument-specific effects. Fantom includes supernatural pianos, strings, brass and woodwind instruments, as well as a selection of choir sounds. Building on zen-core, Fantom has a system that it calls model expansions, which allow you to load emulations of classic Roland synthesizers such as the Jupiter 8 and SH-101. These expansions offer a different editing interface from the standard zen-core sounds, modelled closely on the controls from the emulated synth. Model expansions are not limited to emulating vintage synthesizers, and Roland offers the Enzyme wavetable synth as a paid upgrade to Fantom or as a standard part of the Fantom EX update. The Fantom EX update also brings Roland's analog circuit behavior modeling technology to model expansions, offering new versions of the Jupiter 8, SH-101, JX3P and JD800 that promise to be even closer to the sound of the original synths than the previous model expansion technology. However, these ACB model expansions can only live in Zone 1 of scenes, so you can only have one of them in any scene and you can't run them in the same scene as a vPiano, which also has to inhabit Zone 1. With the exception of vPiano, which has an unlimited voice count, Fantom has 256 voice polyphony, but it should be noted that in Fantom, when it comes to zen-core waveform playback, a stereo sound consists of two voices, so 256 mono voices in Fantom is basically the same as 128 stereo voices for AWM2 in Montage. However, model expansions and supernatural sounds share these 256 voices, and their polyphony use is not well documented. Note stealing and cutout has been widely reported with Fantom as the system runs out of resources to play even some of the factory installed scenes. I'll post links in the description to videos that go into more detail about this. When it comes to sound design and sound editing, we have a bit of a mixed bag. Let's talk about Fantom first. As Fantom supports drag gestures on the touchscreen, it's possible to drag parameter values up and down on the screen, and also to interact directly with envelope graphs, which is a welcome feature. Additionally, the context-sensitive knobs below the touchscreen can often allow multiple parameters to be edited at the same time, which increases the hands-on feeling of the system. When producing new synth sounds using model expansions on the Fantom, the process is very straightforward, as you're essentially looking at the same editing parameters as you would have had on the original instrument being modelled. For example, if we choose a new tone based on the Jupiter 8 model expansion, then we get a collection of controls that allow us to quickly create a sound just as we would using the original Jupiter 8 hardware. This is the zen-core ABM Jupiter 8 model expansion, so we get categories of controls in menus, whereas the new ACB Jupiter 8 expansion on Fantom EX shows a graphical interface that looks like the original hardware. Model expansions are a really nice feature because not only do they produce tones that sound very similar to the synthesizers they model, but they also allow you to design sounds using the same controls as the original hardware. However, in all cases, lots of the synth parameters are on the Fantom touchscreen rather than having physical controls. So if you want a more hands-on approach to model expansions, the Roland System 8 or Jupiter X will provide a better interface with dedicated knobs and sliders for almost every parameter. The V-Piano engine, which is limited to Zone 1, has just a handful of editable parameters. On the front end, we have controls for various resonances and lid position, while under the hood, in the Piano Designer interface, we have a selection of options for tuning and character across the range of keys. Of course, the limited editing capabilities are to be expected, as V-Piano is not a general-purpose synthesizer, and pianos really only have a limited number of editable things. Like V-Piano, the virtual tone wheel organ is modelled, and as such it can only exist in Zone 2. It offers controls for overdrive and the rotary speaker, and a leakage parameter to emulate aging hardware, which is available under the Pro options. The various supernatural sounds have minimal editing capabilities. They're pretty much a case of get what you're given. Opening the editing interface, we see options for different articulations to allow the sound to mimic the instrument being played in different ways. Supernatural sounds often have special articulation effects attached to the mod wheel. The heart of the Fantom is the zen-core engine, of which Fantom is considered to be the flagship hardware platform. The vast majority of preset sounds on the Fantom use this system, which itself has a range of oscillator options including PCM multi-samples, PCM samples that can sync or cross-mod each other, and a virtual analog mode with a range of oscillator shapes. A zen-core tone may consist of 4 partials. The 4 partials are divided into 2 structures, such that the oscillator from partial 1 can be modulated by partial 3, and likewise partial 2 can be modulated by partial 4. When using PCM sounds, each partial may have a separate left and right waveform, or if you just specify a left waveform, it'll be treated as a mono sound. It's at this point that I must stop to offer a personal opinion, because the way Fantom makes you select PCM waveforms is positively prehistoric. There is absolutely no facility to search for waveforms. You just have to specify the group and bank and then twiddle the knobs to scroll through the entire library of waveforms contained within that bank. For example, if I want to select a Jupiter 8 saw wave sample, I have to refer to the sample list documentation to find that it's located in the internal group, bank C, and waveform number 416, which is a pretty dreadful interface. While you can have 2 waveforms for each PCM-based partial, it's clear that the intention of the designers was for these to be used for stereo effects rather than anything more adventurous, because the right waveform must come from the same group and bank as the left waveform. If you want your partial to contain a Jupiter 8 pulse, which lives in bank A, and a Jupiter 8 saw, which lives in bank C, then you're out of luck, and you'll have to use separate partials to put these waveforms in the same sound. If you choose one of the other oscillator options, you get a single sound for each partial, such as a VA waveshape. Regardless of the oscillator type, each partial can have its own amplifier, filter, and pitch envelopes, its own filter parameters, 2 LFOs, and an EQ system, along with its own modulation matrix. You can drop into a Pro mode, which will present more options on screen simultaneously and expose additional controls. Compared to Yamaha's system, zen-core is quite limited when it comes to reproducing acoustic instruments, and Fantom relies heavily on supernatural sounds and V-Piano for these. For example, there are no facilities within zen-core sounds to play samples that are not directly triggered by a key press. So if you were synthesizing a piano, you couldn't add a sample for the dampers returning to the strings on the piano, or a sample for the keys returning to their rest position. It's also not possible for zen-core sounds to trigger different samples depending on particular articulations. So when playing a flute legato, zen-core will simply play the part of the sample defined by the sustain portion of the amplitude envelope rather than triggering a specific legato sample. With those caveats aside, zen-core is an extremely flexible and capable system, especially when it comes to producing synth sounds. The virtual analog facilities in particular are very easy to work with, and for the most part the zen-core editing interface is well structured and approachable. When combined with Fantom's physical synth controls, it's quick and easy to develop great tones. While Fantom supports 4 partials per tone, the original Montage supports 8 elements per part, and the Montage M can have a mind-boggling 128 elements per part. Each of these elements supports a stereo multi-sample. If I create a new initialized AWM2 sound, I can see that we start with a stereo piano waveform. Having discussed the frankly horrible way Fantom forces the user to select a PCM waveform, the process is distinctly more civilized with Montage, which provides a proper category search interface to locate the waveform you want. Within the category search interface, I can very quickly filter the results by category and subcategory, such as synth lead and analog, or use the text search facility to find a waveform by name. With a waveform selected, each element can have its own pitch, filter, amplifier, LFO, and EQ controls. The AWM2 engine includes a system called Expanded Articulation, or XA, which allows particular elements or groups of elements to be triggered only when the keyboard is played in a particular way, or in special circumstances that would normally not trigger a sound, like when a key is released. In this performance, the AF1 button toggles the part between polyphonic and monophonic modes, and when playing in monophonic mode, elements 4 and 5 are used when the keys are played legato, which in the case of this flute would mean that the notes are not retongued. The Assignable function AF1 and AF2 buttons can switch elements on and off, as in the case of this classical guitar, which switches from regular notes to slides and harmonics depending on the state of the assignable buttons. Don't be fooled into thinking that just because AWM2 is sample-based, it can't produce convincing analog sounds, because it can. Montage and Fantom both have a wide range of samples of analog oscillators from a variety of vintage Oberheim, Roland and sequential circuit synthesizers, which can be used as the basis for full-fat analog tones. Dom Sigalos has a handful of example videos showing the process. One thing that zen-core offers the Fantom, which is not available to the original Montage, is the ability for elements, which are essentially oscillators, to sync or cross-mod each other. Instead, with AWM2, you have to rely on samples of synced oscillators to achieve this. Of course, the ANX engine from Montage M overcomes this limitation with a full-fledged virtual analog synthesizer engine. The fact that the Montage touchscreen doesn't support drag gestures makes parameter editing a little more arduous than on Fantom. This is particularly tedious when it comes to editing envelopes, as you need to edit 2 parameters for each point on the graph, rather than just dragging them on the screen. The ability to have 8 or even 128 separate elements for a sound, each with independent filters, etc., is extremely powerful, to the point where some power users even cram multiple independent sounds split across the keyboard into a single AWM2 part. The fearsome array of editable parameters and the interface in which they're presented means that Montage is absolutely not the ideal synthesizer for those of the knob-twiddling school of sound design. But if you've already created a sound on an analog or VA synth and you want to recreate it, or if you really know what you're doing with subtractive synthesis and you don't need to wiggle knobs to get the sound you want, the AWM2 system in Montage provides a peerless environment in which to do so. When it comes to editing FM sounds, it's well beyond the scope of this video to go into any depth, but Montage goes a fair way to making the process approachable, with graphical representations of algorithms, an interface that looks similar to the AWM editor, and access to the 8 operator and carrier levels via the hardware faders. Montage does have a trick up its sleeve when it comes to working with FMX sounds, and it calls it Smart Morph. If you load FMX sounds into parts 9 to 16 of a performance, the Smart Morph learning system will analyze those sounds and produce a graphical map representing those sounds. This takes about 10 seconds on the original Montage, but Montage M produces results almost immediately. The resulting morph sound will be placed into part 1, so make sure you don't have anything sitting there that you need to keep before you start the learning process. Dragging the cursor around the map will give you sounds that are morphed between each of the source sounds, so you can have a sound that's mostly brought from part 9 with a touch of parts 10 and 11, for example. The analysis is done with machine learning and will produce different results each time it runs, so if you don't like the results of the Smart Morph, you can tell Montage to learn again and again, and it will produce a morph map that emphasizes different aspects of the sound. Montage M has recently introduced a version of Smart Morph that works for ANX sounds as well as FMX. A discussion of Fantom's sound editing capabilities wouldn't be complete without talking about the synthesizer controls on the right of the control panel. There are dedicated sections for oscillators, filters, envelopes and effects, and the LED rings for those controls change colour depending on the engine being used for the current tone, or turn off if any of the controls are unused, as in the case of V-piano and supernatural sounds. Each section has a param button, which allows you to jump directly to the editing interface for the corresponding section if you need access to more in-depth parameters. The oscillator section's 2 knobs change function based on the engine being used, and allow you to choose the oscillator type and subtype. Clicking the knobs can switch between the first and second oscillator when using model expansions. The filter section features a high-resolution analog filter with a resonance control and a button to cycle the filter type between various options. Next is the envelope section, which has dedicated knobs for attack, decay, sustain and release, along with a button to cycle between amp, filter and pitch envelopes. There's also a dedicated knob for the amp level. Finally, the effects section has two knobs to allow you to select an effect and adjust its dry-wet balance. The top knob is also clickable to allow you to quickly bypass the effect completely. Unlike the Fantom, Montage does not have dedicated, almost single-function controls for synth parameters, but the extraordinarily powerful assignable control system available in Montage, which I'll cover shortly in this video, means that almost any parameter for any element or operator can be exposed to a physical control on the Montage control panel in a trivially easy way. Both synthesizers have 8 faders with LED indicators, which are used primarily for controlling the volume of various aspects of your sound. On a 2017 Montage, the position of the fader is indicated with a single illuminated LED, whereas on Fantom and the Montage M, all LEDs under the current position are illuminated. It's a minor difference, but I think the latter approach provides a slightly more immediate visual feedback and it's a bit more eye-candy. The Fantom has a 9th fader, which is normally used to control the volume of USB input and output, but it can switch mode to become a 9th drawbar when using the tone wheel organ sound engine, which is very handy. They both also have 8 endless rotary encoders whose positions are marked with LED rings. Fantom uses its 8 knobs primarily for controlling the stereo pan of zones, but you can assign a MIDI CC number or a parameter to each knob and fader using the Assign 1 and Assign 2 switches. The assignments attached to the knobs and faders in Assign 1 mode are controlled at the scene level, so you can make specific assignments for each scene, while the Assign 2 assignments are defined at the system level, so the assignments made for Assign 2 will be the same for all scenes. It's worth noting that by default the assigned knobs and faders are set to control only the zone that corresponds with their position, so knob 1 and fader 1 controls zone 1 only, and the 4th knob and fader only controls zone 4, which seems slightly counterintuitive when working in assign mode, but thankfully you can go into zone edit and change each knob and fader to control any selection of zones you want. The use of MIDI CCs means that you can use the assignable knobs and faders to control external gear when you set the current zone to external, which is useful. If you set your knobs and faders to generic MIDI CCs rather than specific parameters, you'll need to map those to a parameter you want to control. You do this with a modulation matrix within the tone editor, but the interface to set this up is a bit daunting, especially as you'll find that usually several of the matrix slots are already occupied on most preset tones with assignments for System Control 1 and 2, which are themselves assignable but default to the mod wheel and Aftertouch. So firstly, you find an empty assignment slot, then set the source, which in our case is going to be knob 1, which I've set to MIDI CC 20. Next, we can pick up to 4 destinations within each partial for the control input to manage, and set the amount by which they're going to be offset using the sense input, with a positive number corresponding to a positive offset when you turn the knob, and a negative doing the opposite. This is a powerful sound control system, but it's pretty arduous to set up. Montage's 8 faders are used exclusively for volume control, except in DAW control mode, which we'll discuss later. Normally the faders will control the volume of parts 1 to 8, but if you drop into part control mode, it switches to allow you to edit the volume of the individual elements of a part, whether those are AWM2 elements or FMX operators. Although Montage doesn't allow its 8 faders to be assigned MIDI CCs like Fantom, its 8 assignable knobs are extremely powerful. To the left of the knobs are a group of buttons that allow you to quickly change the mode of the knobs. Let's start with the multi options, as these behave most like the knobs on Fantom, allowing you to edit the pan for each part of the performance just as Fantom does. You can also edit the variation and reverb levels in the same way by cycling the mode. Next, there are 3 buttons which assign a group of controls to the knobs which will either affect the performance as a whole or the selected part. The first group is labelled Tone and includes cutoff, resonance, filter depth, portamento amount, and VCA ADSR. The second group, EQFX, gives quick access to EQ parameters, pan and effects levels. The third group is time focused, including controls for arpeggios and motion sequences. Finally, the Assign button switches the knobs to a mode where assignments can be made on a per performance basis, allowing you to sculpt the functions of the knobs to suit the needs of each performance. This functionality is similar to the Assign 1 mode in Fantom, but the difference is in the interface to make assignments, which is one of the Montage party pieces. You may have noticed while I was showing the sound editing system in Montage that when you select almost any parameter, the Control Assign button lights up. We arm Control Assign by clicking the button, and then turning any of the assignable knobs will instantly map the selected parameter to that knob. Even if that knob already has an assignment, it will add a mapping so the knob controls all the assignments up to a maximum of 10 individual mappings per knob. So let's take a look at what is already mapped for this part. I've got Auto Select enabled, so activating any control will show me what it controls. I see that the first knob controls the dry-wet level for the first insert effect, and the second knob controls the element LFO in two ways. And if I touch the ribbon or the mod wheel, I can also see what they control. In this part, the mod wheel controls the filter cutoff of all elements. So let's reduce the base amount of cutoff first, and then assign filter cutoff to knob 3 as well. But we'll tell it that we want it to control just the first two elements, leaving the others alone, and also map resonance to knob 4. Finally, I'm going to add quick labels so we can see on screen what the knobs do, because for some reason almost none of the preset performances actually label their assignable knobs, which is odd. And now when we move those knobs, we can hear the effect. I'm going to temporarily turn off keyboard control for that part and add another instrument. Let's map the VCA attack to knob 3, and the amount that the LFO affects the filter to knob 4. We can also use Control Assign to other controls, such as Aftertouch or the mod wheel, just by activating that control while Control Assign is illuminated. Now we can use the assignable knobs to edit those mapped parameters while we have a part directly selected. If we drop out of part control mode and return to performance control, the knobs now control parameters at the performance level. But we can edit the performance and map the performance level knobs to control the knobs at the part level very simply, and get an array of controls allowing us to control individual part parameters without directly selecting the affected part. And now comes the really clever bit. We can instruct the super knob to control those assignable knobs in any way we see fit. So let's say we want the super knob to affect the first 5 knobs. Then we can set the knobs to how we want them with the super knob in its lowest position and store it. And then set the knobs to how we want them with the super knob at its highest position and store that too. And then when we turn the super knob, the assignable knob will morph between the states we store. The Montage M adds a midpoint state for the super knob, so you can morph the knobs between 3 states instead of just 2 with the original Montage. The super knob can also be turned with a foot controller, such as the Yamaha FC7, so you can keep your hands on the keys. This method of control assignment is seriously powerful and is unique to Montage. While you can use mute and solo to specify which parts of your arrangement make a sound when you play, if you do so, any sustained notes being played will immediately cut out as soon as you silence their parts, whereas they will continue to sound if you just switch keyboard control. Keyboard control only affects which sounds will trigger when you play the keys, and has no effect upon sounds that are already playing. Switching keyboard control is done using the keyboard control icon for each part on the touchscreen on Montage. When you don't have a specific part selected, or you select a part with keyboard control enabled, all parts with keyboard control enabled will play. If you select a part that does not have keyboard control enabled, including any of parts 9 to 16, only that part will respond to the keyboard. Mute and solo controls are also available right on the performance interface. Fantom has a different approach, with physical buttons to set keyboard control. This top row of buttons, known as Zone Select, sets the active zone, which will always play. This can also be selected by clicking the zone on the touchscreen. The bottom row of buttons is called Zone Internal External and works in the same way as the keyboard control toggle on Montage. When a zone has Zone Internal External activated, the button will light up red, and the zone will play when you select any zones that have Zone Internal External enabled, while selecting any zone that does not have the Zone Internal External activated will result in just that zone playing. The Zone Internal External buttons have 2 additional states. The first of these can be accessed by pressing Shift at the same time as the button, which sets the zone to be external, meaning that it's intended to control other instruments via MIDI. In external mode, the button lights up green. One thing to be aware of here is that an external zone is considered to be part of the keyboard control group, so playing these zones will also play any other zones with keyboard control enabled. The second additional state is to indicate that a zone is muted. Muting zones on Fantom is done via the mixer interface on the touchscreen or using the pad grid, and when a zone is muted, its zone internal external button lights up orange. On a personal level, this choice of colours is really annoying, as I have red-green colour blindness, and so I really struggle to see the state each zone is in based on the colour of the buttons. Montage M now offers physical buttons below the faders to toggle keyboard control, similar to Fantom. Both instruments offer a sequencer, although the facilities available are quite different. But if all you want to do is quickly add a percussion part to your arrangement, both Montage and Fantom have a facility to do that without getting your hands dirty with the sequencer. Clicking the Rhythm Pattern button on Fantom will bring up the Rhythm Pattern page. From here, you can select a kit to suit your scene, and you can hear it playing the selected pattern, which has separate sections for intro, verses, fills and ending, which can be triggered by clicking them on screen. By default, every kit will play the Rock 1 rhythm pattern until you change it to something suitable. There's no browser here for either kits or patterns, so you just have to use the data wheel to move through the list, or enter the number of the specific thing you want. As far as I can tell, rhythm patterns can only control Zone 10, which contains the standard drum kit in an initialized scene. That means that you can use the tone browser to pick a kit from the zone view, but it also means that if you've assigned something other than a drum kit to Zone 10, the rhythm pattern system is going to be doing some very strange things. On Montage, adding a percussion part is as simple as pressing Shift and Control Assign, which will present an interface where you can select a drum kit. As soon as you select a kit and press a key, the percussion part will start. Each drum kit comes pre-assigned with a selection of suitable rhythm pattern arpeggios. The category browser allows you to pick from any of the thousands of rhythm patterns available, including any user kits you may have created. When you're happy, you can return to the performance page and everything will be set up for you, with the kit added to the next available part, or you can press Control Assign again and the percussion part will be cancelled. The Fantom onboard sequencer offers real-time recording, step recording, and TR-Rec sequencing. Recorded patterns can be chained together to make a song. TR-Rec sequencing is particularly approachable for percussion parts, and it's easy enough to use that my kids often play around with it. It's as simple as selecting a zone containing a drum tone, entering TR-Rec mode, picking a drum sound on the keyboard, and using the 16 step buttons to define when the sound should play, then moving on to another sound and repeating the process. To change anything you've already input, just select the sound again using the keyboard and change the selected buttons. Each sequencing mode allows the recorded patterns to be edited after recording using a piano roll editor, although I will maintain forever that the place to be doing such things is in a DAW, not a tiny screen on a keyboard. It's better to think of the Montage sequencer as more of an idea jotter, because it only supports live recording and overdub editing, rather than having any form of step recording or piano roll editor. Recorded patterns can be chained together to make a song, or assigned to scenes, which have a very different meaning from the Fantom use of the word. Within a performance, you may define up to 8 scenes using the 8 scene buttons. Scenes allow you to store and recall snapshots of your performance in a particular state, and as the very makeup of the sounds in a performance is controlled by the performance itself, rather than being a separate data structure, the amount of parameters that can be linked to scenes makes them extremely powerful. As an example, you might have a single performance to play a song, but have different variations of the performance stored as scenes to represent the intro, the verse, the chorus, and the bridge. Within each scene, you can set the parts which have keyboard control enabled, the mixer settings, configuration and state of the super knob, the arpeggios and motion sequences attached to each part, and even the VCA ADSR settings for each sound in the performance. Fantom has a similar-ish system where you can store the current keyboard control settings to one of the 16 pads in keyboard switch group mode, but this is just one of the parameters available to the Montage scene system. Fantom also offers a sampler using the audio input jacks on the back of the unit. Frustratingly though, there's no way to control the loop point of samples using the onboard systems. There's just a toggle to switch loop on or off. Fantom has a basic chord memory system that allows you to trigger chords by pressing single notes, though I think it's too basic to be genuinely useful. Fantom has the ability to arpeggiate notes, but it's a very limited system. There are 128 arpeggio styles on offer, each of which can be modified using various playback styles including basic up, down, random, note order and glissando patterns, as well as a phrase type, which is useful for arpeggio styles designed specifically for particular instrument types. Crucially, Fantom has no way to create your own user arpeggios, so the limited selection of arpeggios on offer is all that's available. The arpeggiator is enabled at the scene level and offers just one arpeggio pattern to all zones, which can opt in or out of being arpeggiated. If you want to have a different arpeggio working for your acoustic guitar and your bass, you'll need to handle that with the sequencer, not the arpeggiator on Fantom. In contrast, the arpeggio system built into Montage deserves a video in its own right, as it's a massively capable system, inherited from the Motif series and expanded hugely. Montage offers over 10,000 preset arpeggios, including several thousand rhythm patterns, and their abilities to respond to different articulations and key sequences is quite staggering. Montage also allows you to convert a recorded pattern to a user arpeggio, which will intelligently respond to different notes being held. Further, each part in a Montage performance can have its own arpeggio, and scene changes can trigger an arpeggio switch, so your performances can have multiple arpeggios playing simultaneously. Several of the preset performances demonstrate this ability. When using arpeggios or recorded patterns while playing live, it can sometimes be a challenge to keep the tempo on your synth synced to your primary rhythm source, especially if that source is a live drummer. Montage has a very useful feature to help with this called Auto Beat Sync. This system can monitor an incoming audio signal over the HD inputs, which could be a mic on the kick drum or anything else with a strong rhythm, and intelligently match the internal tempo to the incoming signal in real time, adjusting the playback of any arpeggios or recorded patterns automatically. This ability to intelligently monitor the incoming audio signal gives rise to another unique feature, which Montage calls Envelope Follower. This system allows a monitored audio signal, which can come from the analog input ports or even the audio output of any other part of the current performance, to be used as a modulation source for any assignable parameter, which can produce some wild results. Rounding out this clutch of motion-related features is the Montage concept of motion sequences. Montage defines 4 separate motion sequence lanes to which parameters can be attached, along with a separate lane specifically for the super knob. Each lane can hold up to 8 separate motion sequences. In its most simple form, a motion sequence would be no different from an LFO, in that the value would simply oscillate between 2 states in a repeating pattern. But using the motion sequence editor, it's possible to define up to 16 steps in a sequence, each having different levels, which can be adjusted using the hardware faders. Each step can use one of 2 different curve types, with various parameters available to fine-tune those curves. Motion sequences can loop or run just once and can either trigger with a key press or manually with the motion sequence trigger button. A sequence that's already in motion can be paused and resumed with the motion sequence hold button. Once sequences have been defined, you can switch between numbered sequences using the 3rd row of the button grid. Montage and Fantom can both act as remote controllers for a variety of DAW software. Montage offers DAW remote support for Cubase, Logic Pro, Pro Tools, and Ableton Live. Regardless of the DAW being controlled, the Montage remote looks the same and operates in the same way via 3 modes: track, plugin, and transport. In all modes, the transport buttons control playback and recording, and the data dial can be used as a jog wheel to move the playhead around. Track mode sets the knobs and faders to control the pan and volume of a bank of 8 tracks, and provides controls to allow you to jump between blocks of 8 tracks on the touchscreen for projects that have more than 8 tracks. You can also map functions to all the controls to the left of the keyboard and to any connected foot controllers. The names of each of the 8 tracks are shown on screen, as are the pan settings for each track, but the volume is not, and there are no VU meters to monitor the track's audio output. The second mode is plugin, where all the assignable controls can be given discrete MIDI CC numbers to control the currently armed software instrument. Finally, there's transport mode, where the panel controls revert to controlling the Montage sound engine rather than DAW parameters, but the transport controls continue to control the DAW. The Montage DAW remote is not very visually exciting, but it does the job well enough. The Fantom DAW remote supports Logic Pro, Mainstage and Ableton Live, so if you're a Windows user, you get a grand total of one DAW option. However, the Fantom offers a tighter DAW integration than Montage. When controlling Logic, Fantom shows 8 tracks at once, with each track showing the track name, volume and pan, and a VU meter showing the current sound output level. Transport controls are available on screen and also using the physical controls that normally control the Fantom sequencer. Additionally, you can switch the on-screen view to plug-in control mode, which maps the on-screen controls to Logic's smart control system for the current track, which you can either edit on the touchscreen or use a slightly clunky select-click edit system using the second knob under the screen, or far better, to click both assign buttons together, which switches the function of the 8 knobs to control the Logic smart controls. There's a third view mode, which shows the current playhead position and a variety of playback info, and you can switch the Fantom pads to DAW control mode, which provides another group of controls, including the ability to zoom the timeline, jump to markers, and recall screen sets. However, there is a major problem here. Logic Pro is exclusive to macOS, and in 2020 Apple started the process of moving the entire Macintosh lineup away from Intel processors to Apple Silicon, completing the transition with the release of the Mac Pro in 2023. To assist with the transition, Apple introduced a technology called Rosetta, which allows Macs with Apple Silicon to run Intel apps. It took Roland until March 2022 to certify that their Logic Pro plugin would work with Apple Silicon in Rosetta mode, and there have been no further releases since then. Which means that in order to get access to the Fantom DAW remote functionality, you have to hobble Logic Pro by running Logic itself in Rosetta mode. I refuse to run Logic in Rosetta mode on my Mac, and as a result I'm completely unable to use the Fantom DAW remote, which is rubbish. Fantom's integration with Ableton Live is slightly more limited than its Logic plugin, but provides all the most important controls, including a session view. You can launch clips and scenes directly from the touchscreen, just as you would from the software interface. There's also a mixer view, in which the faders control the volume of the tracks shown on screen, although the knobs are set to control the 8 parameters of the selected software instrument or effect, so there's no hardware control for the pan of each track as far as I can see, apart from just moving the on-screen cursor to the pan control and using the data dial to input a value, or just dragging it on screen. Confusingly, the selecty-clicky edity approach that was available on the Logic plugin doesn't seem to work here. On the plus side, you don't have to run live in Rosetta mode on modern Macs, so at least it's actually usable. Both Montage and Fantom are capable of transmitting Aftertouch from their keys, meaning that you can press keys a little further than the end of their natural travel to activate an additional modulation source. On Montage, Aftertouch feels like a natural extension of the key action after reaching the bottom of the standard travel, and it's easy to press the keys down a little harder to activate Aftertouch with a fine level of control. Here I'm using my weakest finger to activate Aftertouch, but you can see from the MIDI monitor that I can easily control the amount of Aftertouch. The action has less Aftertouch movement than FATAR actions like the TP8SK action on the Waldorf Quantum Mark II, but I don't find that it's difficult or unresponsive in any way. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for Fantom, where Aftertouch activation requires too much force to be genuinely considered playable. In fact, on Fantom 8, I'm unable to activate Aftertouch at all with that same finger. The Aftertouch requires an obscene amount of pressure to activate, such that it's almost impossible to control with any nuance, and it's all but unusable. The official response is that users who have problems should use the Aftertouch sensitivity setting, but I already have mine set to maximum, and it's still basically useless. If Aftertouch is important to you, make sure you audition a Fantom before committing, because you may be very disappointed. As we've seen, both synthesizers are centered around a touchscreen interface. The Fantom screen is higher resolution than Montage and is slightly more responsive. As I've previously mentioned, Fantom supports drag gestures, allowing you to touch a parameter and drag it about to change its value. The Montage screen is limited to a point-and-click system, which is a drag. To edit a parameter, you have to select it on screen and then either drop to an additional screen interface to enter a number or use the data encoder wheel to adjust the value. Additionally, I find that I have to use the screen recalibration tool on my Montage periodically, as clicks on the screen sometimes register slightly away from the spot where I clicked, and this has never been an issue on my Fantom. The Fantom touchscreen is flanked by 6 context-sensitive knobs, which allow you to edit on-screen parameters without actually touching it. This is an approach that's been adopted by Montage M, and it's a welcome addition. On Fantom, these knobs are also clickable for selection purposes, and are each surrounded by their own colour-changing LED, which can provide additional hints as to the function of each knob, including turning the LED off when the knob has no assignment. To the far left of the Montage, we have the pitch and modulation wheels and a sensitive ribbon controller, the function of which is easy to set using the control assign system. Next to these, we have Assign 1 and Assign 2, which function either in a momentary fashion or as toggles depending on the performance. They can be used to switch any number of parameters between different states, or they can control the playback of individual AWM elements using expanded articulation. Above the keyboard are the master arpeggio on-off and motion sequence on-off toggles. With these disabled, no arpeggios and no motion sequences will play. Above the master volume slider is the A to D input toggle and a rotary gain control for the input, along with an LED to indicate clipping. Above the super knob are the 2 buttons that are used to instantly switch between the left and right states of the super knob. Holding down Shift with these buttons functions to store the current assignable knob positions to each position of the super knob. Below the super knob are the playback and recording transport controls, the control assign button, and the octave shift buttons, which light up to indicate an active octave shift. These double up as transpose buttons when pressed along with Shift, although very annoyingly there's no always-on indicator that the keyboard is currently transposed, which has caught me out several times. Looking at Fantom, we have Roland's signature pitch modulation lever wiggly thingy, whose functions are replicated with pitch and mod wheels further up the body of the instrument. There are octave shift and transpose controls here, and while we go one step better than Montage in that the transpose button stays lit if the keyboard is transposed, there's still no way to see by how much. The chord memory and arpeggio buttons live here, if you can find a use for them, along with the toggle for portamento. The Fantom's S1, S2 and S3 buttons are similar in concept to the Montage's Assign 1 and Assign 2 buttons, but they're much more limited in function as they can only affect one parameter each. Every preset scene I've inspected has the same uses for these buttons. Holding S1 is the same as pushing the mod wheel to maximum, S2 replicates a sustain pedal, and S3 turns reverb on and off. Finally, there's a split button which allows you to split the keyboard between 2 zones by holding the button and pressing a key. Let's take a look at the buttons to the left of the touchscreen. Right brings up an interface to commit any changes to scenes, tones, rhythm patterns, or system settings to permanent memory. Master Effects and Analog Filter bring up the editing interfaces for each of those functions. Motional Pad is an interesting one, as it opens an interface where you can drag a cursor around to crossfade between the tones in 4 different zones, although this system sits on top of the fundamental level of each zone, so you won't see the levels on the faders moving as you drag the cursor around. DAW Control opens the DAW control system, and Menu is the starting point for accessing various deeper elements of the system, including the mixer and the zone editor. Immediately to the right of the touchscreen, Fantom has an array of buttons for working with scenes. From here you can switch between the scene browser and zone view, where multiple clicks on the zone view button will cycle the number of zones visible on screen from 1 to 16. There's also a button for single tone play, which essentially jumps out of the scene system entirely and allows you to just play one single tone. There's a chain button here for use with patterns recorded on the sequencer, though I'm not sure why it's been placed where it is rather than with the rest of the sequencer controls. And there's a dedicated tempo button, which brings up a panel to allow you to input a tempo with the data wheel, or you can use it as a tap tempo input. Finally, there's a shift button, which extends the functions of various other controls. I do wish both Fantom and Montage had a shift button on either side of the control panel, as Yamaha has done with Montage M. At the bottom of the panel, Fantom has 16 step buttons for use with its built-in TR-Rec sequencer. As we've seen, these buttons also double up as top-level category selectors for picking sounds. Above these are the playback and recording controls, along with various buttons for controlling the sequencer. Moving up again, we have the dedicated synth controls, which are all LED backlit. As any of these controls are used, the corresponding parameter shows up on the touchscreen. To the right is the pad grid and buttons to set its mode. Unfortunately, these pads are not velocity sensitive, so their use for finger drumming is distinctly limited. The pad grid's function can be switched between various modes, including sample playback, zone mute, zone solo, and a keyboard switch group mode that allows the zone internal-external buttons to be toggled between different settings. On the right side of the Montage control panel, we have the data encoder wheel and directional buttons, along with the increment and decrement buttons, which can be used to shift a value up or down by a single increment, and which double up as yes/no buttons for on-screen dialogues. Below these is the exit button, which is more like a return button in that it will step up out of the current interface to the one immediately above it. The enter button doubles as a shortcut to the tempo controls and acts as a tap tempo control within it. The performance home button will return you from wherever you are to the main performance page, with the performance itself selected rather than any of its parts. Multiple clicks cycles the view mode from showing groups of 8 parts on screen to showing groups of 4 together with a keyboard split overview, and finally a view that shows the smart morph map if one is available for the current performance. A shift click on Performance Home will open the Performance Overview, where you can stare in a slightly bewildered fashion at lots of coloured lines showing relationships between different controls. Below this, the Utility button opens System Settings or the Quick Setup menu, which allows you to quickly change MIDI and audio output settings when working with a DAW. The Edit button will open the editing interface for the currently selected item, whether that's a performance or a part. Within that interface, you can use the button grid to select the performance, a part, or an element or operator within a part. The top 2 rows of the grid allow you to select a single part. When you do so, the third row allows you to select a single element, while the bottom row allows you to mute and solo individual elements or operators. The lower Common button allows you to drop back out of the element editor to the part editor, while the upper Common button returns to the performance editing interface. If you make any edits, you can press Edit again to enter Compare mode, where you can temporarily return to the pre-edited version of your sound and play it. A second press returns to the edited version. Store will open the interface to commit your current performance to permanent memory. The Live Set button opens the Live Set view, or if you shift-click it, it functions as a shortcut to assign the current performance to the current live set. Whilst in Live Set view, the left side of the button grid represents the 4x4 live set view, while the right side allows you to select one of the 16 pages of each live set bank. The Category Search button will open the Performance Search interface unless you're currently viewing the waveform page of a part, in which case it will open the Waveform Search system. Whilst in the search interface, the button grid acts as a mirror of the on-screen interface, with the top 2 rows picking the category, the third row picking the subcategory, and the fourth row picking one of the first 8 on-screen results. The lower mute and solo buttons scroll the page up and down. Performance Control and Part Control switch the functions of the button grid. In Performance Control mode, the top row of the button grid selects a part, while the second row toggles mute and solo for each part. The Common button selects the performance itself rather than any single part. The third row selects the global motion sequence number from 1 to 8, and the fourth row does the same for arpeggios. In Part Control mode, the top 2 rows of the button grid select part 1 to 16, or set mute and solo for each of those parts when those controls are activated. The third and fourth rows toggle motion sequence and arpeggio for the 8 parts shown on screen. In DAW remote mode, the button grid takes on yet another set of functions, with vertical strips of the grid representing the 8 currently controlled tracks in the DAW. The top row is used to select a track, the second and third rows set mute and solo, and the fourth row allows additional tracks to be record-armed. The bank up and down buttons will jump the group of controlled tracks up and down in groups of 8, while the page up and down buttons will do the same but just one track at a time. When I started using Montage, I barely used the button grid as I found it very confusing. The labelling, which tries to make sense of the many interconnected functions, doesn't help much. However, as I've grown used to its functions, I've found it to be a very quick way to get around the system, and now I use it all the time. Clearly I wasn't alone with my initial confusion, as Montage M does away with the button grid in its original form, replacing it with a 4x4 grid dedicated to live set selection and category browsing. Some of the functions of the original button grid have been lost, while others have migrated to dedicated controls below the faders on Montage M. Both Montage and Fantom have standard DIN MIDI ports and a USB MIDI interface. If you're planning to connect to a computer in order to use a DAW, the USB option is far superior in both machines, as the USB interface exposes the DAW remote functions and also carries 32 audio channels. That's a stereo channel for each part or zone out of the synth and 6 back out of the computer into the synth. The original Montage has a very strict MIDI implementation, in that part 1 will send and receive MIDI channel 1, part 2 will send and receive channel 2, etc. This is fixed and cannot be edited except by changing the MIDI mode from multi to single, in which case all parts send and receive on a single MIDI channel of your choice. Personally, I haven't found this to be a limiting factor, but it takes some planning to make sure you use it properly, and Montage M has changed the MIDI implementation to allow parts to define their own MIDI channels. While Montage has the facility to communicate with MIDI hardware over either USB MIDI or MIDI over standard DIN MIDI cables, it can't do both at the same time. However, in USB MIDI mode, the MIDI ports become an interface to an external MIDI device, which is advertised to the connected computer as Montage Port 3. Fantom has a more traditional and arguably more flexible MIDI implementation than the original Montage, whereby each zone can set its own MIDI channel and define which interface to use, USB, DIN, or both. Additionally, the MIDI ports on the back of the Fantom can be used at the same time as the USB MIDI interface, so Fantom zones can be driven by devices connected using MIDI cables, or those devices connected to Fantom using MIDI cables can receive MIDI from zones set up to transmit. Both Montage and Fantom allow you to import sounds and MIDI files from a USB drive plugged into the back of the keyboard. They also have the ability to save and restore a backup of your entire system config, including all user waveforms and performances, to the USB drive. Unfortunately, neither the original Montage nor Fantom allow direct import of waveform or MIDI data from a connected computer. You have to go via the intermediate step of writing data to a USB drive first. However, Montage has a utility called Montage Connect, which allows performance settings to be transmitted to and from a DAW, which can be extremely useful. Montage M comes with the ESP plugin, which is essentially a software version of the Montage M that runs inside a DAW and makes importing external data much easier with direct transmission to and from the hardware. When it comes to installing additional sound libraries or model expansions on Fantom, unfortunately this can't be done without switching off the synth and booting up into a special mode, which makes library and expansion management a real pain. There are a handful of other important differences between Fantom and Montage, but they don't make for particularly interesting video, so I'll just present them as text on screen for the next few seconds, and pause the video to read them. If you've made it all this way through the video, I think it should be clear by now that both of these synthesizers are hugely powerful instruments. However, there is a clear difference in the design philosophy of these systems. Fantom feels like a studio full of a variety of disparate synths and controllers which hang together relatively loosely, while Montage feels like a single integrated instrument in its own right, where all constituent parts are fully interconnected and speak the same language. Things like Fantom's zone offset not automatically picking up edits to tones that could be handled with offsets suggests a lack of cohesion at the design stage, and while many people would be happy manually dialing in those offsets, the lack of cohesion seems clunky when compared to Montage. Of course, this video has been comparing the 2017 Montage with the 2019 Fantom, and now it's 2024. But none of the things that I dislike about Fantom have been improved with the Fantom EX update, which focuses primarily on new sound engines, including the brilliant ACB model expansions. The 2023 Montage M addresses many of the concerns users had with the original model. It offers a brand new virtual analog engine in the form of ANX and provides new overview and navigation interfaces to help users get the most out of the synthesis engines. The physical layout and controls have been improved, although maddeningly the screen technology remains unchanged, and you still can't use USB and DIN MIDI simultaneously. This video was intended to allow you to make up your own mind about which of these great instruments suits your needs better, so I'm not going to offer any more of my own opinions, but if I absolutely couldn't keep them both, it would be the Montage that would stay in my studio. If you found this video useful or interesting, please hit the like and subscribe buttons, because I have a range of new topics to cover in the future, and I'd love to hear your views on this and any other of my videos. Until next time, sayonara.